Our feature speaker today is Pablo Bose, who is a migration and urban studies scholar. Born in India and raised in Canada, he is interested in the ways that people and landscapes shape one another. Bose is an associate professor of geography in the Department of Geography and director of the Global and Regional Studies program at the University of Vermont. His three main research projects currently are on refugee resettlement in North America and Europe, on environmentally induced displacement, and on cities of the global South. Recent books include Refugees in New Destinations and Small Cities, Resettlement in Vermont, and Urbanization in India, Global Indians, and the Remaking of Kolkata. Welcome all of you, and thank you for joining us today. And I will turn it over to Pablo.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to Secil and to Josh for inviting me. And thank you all for joining. I'm gonna turn on my PowerPoint here and just quickly, wait, is this sharing? I don't think it is. Let's see, share. Here we go. Hopefully that is shared.
Yes, we can.
All right, great, thank you. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about one of the projects that I've been working on over the last year and a half. And so I'll talk today about this nexus between environment, refugees, and risk, and specifically looking at the overlaps between environmental vulnerability, public health crises, and refugee camps. As was mentioned a moment ago, I'm an urban geographer and a migration studies scholar. I've done a lot of work on displacement, especially by development projects, by environmentally induced displacement, and also as a consequence of urbanization. My latest project, which I just wrapped up with NSF funding, specifically looked at refugee resettlement, the other side of this kind of displacement and forced migration story, and looking at resettlement, especially in newer destinations outside of major metropolitan areas. So there's a few of the more recent works that I've looked at and published, kind of looking at refugee resettlement across the US, in the US and Canada, and some of the ethics of doing this type of research. There's a few other studies that I'm engaged in currently. Most of my work tends to be community-based and community-focused. And so right now, as you might imagine, with all that's kind of swirling around us, to do with migration and refugees, immigrants, asylum seekers, et cetera. There's a lot of these topics that are kind of on the go. The work that I've been doing in the US, most recently I've been engaged in a number of conversations about what it would look like to rebuild the US refugee program after 4 years plus of being systematically kind of broken down by the previous administration. And also what resettlement in the EU looks like post-pandemic. Locally in Vermont, I've been doing a number of studies with my community partners on COVID-19 impacts in the areas of telemedicine, childcare, food security. And I've also been doing some work on asylum and border policies between the US and Canada, looking at the temporary protected status programs, safe third country, and also border surveillance. A number of these programs, especially some of the international ones, as you can imagine, have been on hold in different ways as a result of the pandemic. But right now, that is more necessary than ever to engage in some of this work. Also, in various stages of completion are some of the projects that I've been engaged in overseas. So a project on sustainability and migration in Mongolia, in the top left there, some of this work with refugee camps on the bottom, and then some of the work we've been doing in Bangladesh, looking specifically at urbanization, climate change effects, and displacement there. So this idea of environmental displacement has been central to my work for a long time. As I said at the outset, I'd sort of come into this work with a focus on refugees and forced migration as a result of development projects. But I got particularly interested in the ways in which environmental change, resource extraction, conservation, climate change, all of these things were inciting events in many ways for different forms of forced migration. So when the pandemic first arose, one of the questions that kind of came to mind led to this particular project that I'll talk about here, which was when we talk about a number of these kinds of crises, we often talk about them in isolation. We talk about them as solely a public health crisis, a political conflict, an environmental risk. But in what ways are these kinds of factors overlapping, interlocking? In what ways do we need to understand the ways that they produce, reinforce, contradict, or in other ways interact with one another? The idea for this in part came out of conversations I was having really from the beginning of the pandemic, as we looked at lockdowns, as we looked at, right off the bat, a number of the routes of travel, the regular routes of travel for migrants and asylum seekers began to be shut down. So the camps themselves became closed down. The different kinds of camps we have were being closed down. And there were considerable fears right off the bat that, what was going to happen in these camps. The threat of kind of catastrophic spread through the camps was really something that was being talked about a lot. So I, along with a couple of colleagues here at UVM, Kelsey Gleason, who's an epidemiologist, and Brendan Fisher, who's an ecologist, proposed this particular project, looking specifically at COVID-19 refugee camps and these kinds of risks. To put this into context, of course, we are in a particular era in which refugees and displaced persons are at historic highs in the modern period. And this is a trend that has been growing exponentially over the past decade. So in 2010, UNHCR had just under 35 million people who were persons of concern for them. In 2020, that number has ballooned to 80 million, to over 80 million people. And this, of course, really is primarily referring to those who are recognized internationally as refugees, those who are seen by international law as deserving protection, but it doesn't cover many other people who are also displaced. So again, we have a sense of this, many people displaced. And while the politics in the global north in particular are focused on this politics of backlash and, we're being flooded by refugees and so on and so forth, the reality is a very, very small number of people who are forcibly displaced are actually going to be resettled to a third country. The vast number of refugees are, of course, in a neighboring country, and the vast number are actually in refugee camps in those countries. And so again, we see here, if we look at the countries of origin and the countries of host, we see countries like Turkey, Bangladesh, Sudan, et cetera, being the host countries rather than the countries of the global north. And despite this, of course, we continue to see this backlash against refugees coming for resettlement, but another part of this story is the fact that as this kind of xenophobic backlash against refugee resettlement in countries of the global north picks up steam, one of the components of this is that as certain conflicts produce more refugees, take the Rohingya, the attacks on the Rohingya, their flight to Bangladesh, one of the things that a number of national governments do is they say that if we provide any support for the Rohingya, it will not be for resettlement, it will be for the refugee camp in Bangladesh. So the US government, for example, that was a policy that they pursued. So this sort of this kind of placement within the camps for refugees becomes even more more of a situation in that that situation. So this fear of a brown, black, other planet has this dual kind of effect. On the one hand, we have this shutting down of routes of resettlement to the global north, but the camps that are present in many cases really swell in size and become more permanent in different ways. And so what we really see when we look at refugee camps, and this is of course a huge simplification of this, is several shifts over time. Refugee camps, as we have inherited them, are really a legacy of post-Second World War conceptions of the refugee. So they're really about this kind of notion of the displaced person in a in a devastated Europe, devastated especially Central and Eastern Europe. And so there was a real sense of the refugee as being temporary, the refugee as being housed in a mainly rural and temporary camp, and that the conflict that they were fleeing from was generally a state-to-state conflict, something that resulted in the possibility of return. So the right of return, the right to return without, returning to the same forms of harm that you had left, all of these kinds of ideas were really baked into that. Now, of course, there are clear exceptions to this. The long-term generational displacement of Palestinians in camps and in urban camps in many cases is different from this notion. But really still into the 1990s, we had a lot of camps that still were somewhat smaller, were more rural, and still had this notion that they would be temporary. But by the 1990s, really before that as well, we had more and more of these protracted conflicts where people were simply not going to return to whatever actual or putative homeland that they wished to. And so you had, for example, the Lhotshampa from Bhutan, Nepali-speaking, mainly Hindu, who had been, a sixth of the population had been driven from their homes and were in camps in Nepal. They were never going to go home. Eventually, they do get resettled, mostly to North America. But you have this shift to much more protracted conflicts. And as a result of these, the refugee camps themselves get bigger and bigger and bigger and more like semi-permanent settlements, small towns, than they are these kinds of temporary rural places. And so that's the bigger sort of context in which we were working. We wanted to look at what was happening in these refugee camps, which, as I said, are growing in size, are more urban in many cases. And we wanted to look at the 25 largest camps and what was going on, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Just to set the context of this, what we found was really surprising was that there was actually limited COVID-19 outbreaks in refugee camps. So we were really curious as to why, as we looked over this year. Through December of last year, there were 21,000 cases across all the refugee camps under UNHCR control. Now, by December, as numbers were on the rise across the world, we were starting to see small but concerning outbreaks. 32 new cases in Cox's Bazar. Again, 32 new cases out of a population of 900,000. But still, there were some localized outbreaks. So outbreaks in camps in Greece, increases in cases in Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. When we looked into why there were originally this kind of this idea of why were there limited cases, especially when we'd gone into this project and we'd been looking at some of the parallels. Look at the outbreaks in prisons, in prisons in many different places. In the US, for example, massive outbreaks in a number of different prisons. Again, you have those dense living conditions, you have limited access to healthcare. There are all of these other kinds of underlying issues already. So some of the ideas around, well, why were there limited outbreaks in the refugee camps? Could it be because of testing? what we found, there was a little bit of that could be testing. Much more than that, it was isolation from host communities, and that these camps, many of which are under military jurisdiction, had very restrictive lockdowns. And what you really saw, who was not moving in and out of the camp, was really the actual, the humanitarian workers. So it shifted to much more of a residential staff, and the international staff did much less travel in and out. So that was one of the things that we found we were really sort of surprised by. But the other thing that we started off this project really interested in, and the genesis of this project really was from a series of conversations I'd had. I was already doing some of this work with refugee camps and camp directors, and I was having this conversation with camp staff in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. This is one of the largest camps in the world. And she was saying, and I was saying to her, are you worried about COVID-19? How is it that you're preparing for this, et cetera? And this person said to me, yeah, it's on our radar, but right now, what we're really concerned with is there's a Category 5 super cyclone spinning up in the Bay of Bengal. I've got I've got meetings with the military commanders outside who are worried about this, this, and this. There were all of these things that were coming together. I'm worried about monsoon season. And I said, well, how have you prepared for these kinds of epidemic outbreaks and things like this? And they were saying, well, for us, much of our planning has been over the last few years about cholera. How do we prepare for cholera? Well, preparing for cholera, a waterborne disease, is obviously very different than preparing for something like COVID-19 or H1N1 or any of these other kinds of things. And so we wanted to look at how these kinds of vulnerabilities came together. And so our key questions when we began this project about a year ago was to look at the environmental risk factors that surround the refugee camps. And what other kinds of vulnerabilities are exposed by these risk factors? How might they, in this particular case, impact COVID-19 response in camps? But our project has actually expanded to look well beyond COVID-19 to other kinds of public health crises. We also wanted to look at what sorts of plans and policies are in place at the UN level, at the country level, at the camp administration level. How could these policies be improved by looking at environmental risk in particular? There's a lot of consideration of political threats, political risks, and there are some, although I've been a little bit surprised by the limited amount of planning for public health crises. But in terms of environmental risks, it's much more piecemeal. Cox's Bazar has, I would say, the most comprehensive planning when it comes to that, and I'll show that in a moment. But in a lot of other places, there was much less. I'm just going to skim through some of this. Looking at records of natural disasters, we went back a number of years looking at watershed analysis, flood risks, variations in weather. We use the International Disasters Database, national registries. Again, these are really different depending on the actual place and the context. And we did some other kinds of literature reviews. We looked a lot at the camp data itself, camp services. One of the things that, as you might imagine, has been really frustrating throughout all of this is we're doing this because of pandemic. Everything is at a distance. It's really hard to do this kind of work at a distance. And while we've done a little bit of interviewing with camp staff, we're completely missing the voices of people within these camps. And especially, in Cox's Bazar, we've had some discussion with some camp leaders around, there's some pretty interesting things that the local communities themselves are doing, but that's something that needs much more inquiry from us. Again, our main sites have been Cox's Bazar. So we looked at the 25 largest sites. And again, as you can see here, there's a real clustering of sites in Africa. There's some parts of the Middle East and in Bangladesh. But our main focus has been on 3 camps in particular. As I said, one of the things that we've been doing has been looking historically at some of the record of different kinds of risks in each of these places. So we were looking at flood risks. And again, thinking about the context of camps themselves, whether they are in a more rural or a more urban area, these are, of course, built on primarily marginal land. And therefore, they're already come with different kinds of risks involved. Add to that sometimes a significant pressure on land from the sheer number of people that might be housed there, and it exacerbates those kinds of vulnerabilities. We were looking at health facilities within camp complexes. We were looking at different kinds of services, emergency services that are available. In each of the different places, we had begun to look at specific microdata within the camps. Again, I mentioned Cox's Bazar, Dadaab, and Zatari are the 3 big ones that we've been looking at. And they're really composed of sort of smaller, well, not really smaller, but complexes together. So they're really multiple communities together. And so even within those communities, there are different kinds of risks. The monsoon risks, the flood risks, the landslide risks in some places, the access to water in others, all can depend even within a camp itself, can vary significantly. Here you see the cyclone risk within Cox's Bazar, that it really depends on which part of the camp you're in. So again, cyclone risk here. So one of the tools that our partners have asked us to try and develop is a predictive instrument. We've seen in different ways the use of these kinds of dashboards or predictive instruments as we've seen our way through parts of the pandemic over the last year. And that was one of the things that some of our partners said, would there be a way for you to bring together data that would show us what environmental risk, they're particularly interested in the environmental risk component of this, because that would also allow some kind of planning and tailoring of responses to public health crises based on specific kinds of environmental risk. Again, in thinking about that moment that always sticks out to me, the camp staff person saying to me, I've got cyclones coming up, it's monsoon season, there's been a few more cases reported, and mentioned that they had piled, this is in Cox's Bazar, they'd piled supplies on the roof of a building, and it had been overrun by monkeys, and they could not figure out how to deal with this. And so that's a very specific case, but how do you deal with all of these kinds of things? So we were looking at how we actually put some of this stuff together. We looked at other kinds of dashboards that are out there that have been used. And we looked at a number of these different kinds of perspectives, how you streamline data, how you look at this as being more than simply statistics, how you understand the particular risks that people live through. One of the biggest challenges for us is sourcing the necessary data. And we've been through multiple iterations of this. When we first started, or the very first one, we were hoping to do something that would be a real-time dashboard for reporting cases. And this was, again, if you think back to the very, very early days of the pandemic and the John Hopkins dashboards, where people were, I was obsessively looking at, where are the case counts and stuff like that. One of the things we ran into right away, so this was in one particular camp where we had talked to they had 8 different clinics. And so we were set up and we were like, okay, so if we get daily case counts and case reporting, we can do a real-time updating and this and that. But at the end of the day, the national government in that particular place and the military that was running that camp said, no way. They absolutely refused to let us have any of that data. And so, and there's all sorts, I can talk about why I think that is, but But so that became really challenging. There's a lot of unevenness and inconsistency about the type of data, about how to represent the different kinds of data. How do you represent certain kinds of vulnerabilities that are about longer term climate change than are about shorter term disasters and things like this? And so getting access to the data, we've had some really good conversations with UNHCR and International Organization on Migration and a bunch of others, but we also, it's a lot of work to sort of continually update this. So there's a lot of work still to be done in figuring this out. I've probably gone on for quite a while. I have gone on for quite a while, but I'm just gonna give a little bit of an illustration of what the camps look like, just to give a sense of their scale and how different their respective environments themselves kind of look like. So Cox's Bazar, as I mentioned before, it's a series of coastal camps, which today house over 900,000 people. 900,000 people, Rohingya, who again fled the genocidal attacks of Myanmar's military, who, as we know, have now turned their attention on other parts of their population. And there are different parts of this camp, again, which are built up into, there's some that are really coastal, some that are built up into parts of the hillside, but really significant populations, and monsoon rains, landslides, cyclones, and in a longer term, sea level rise are some of the things that are really significant challenges. Food security within the camp, a huge issue. You can see some greenery there, but access to food is a real issue. Dadaab is another one of these camps in which we see an example of protracted stay over significant periods of time. Again, stretched out in a more rural context in this case, although again, in many ways, there are parts of Dadaab that are more like a small city, or a relatively large city, and towns, markets, other kinds of process of urbanization that are going on. Some of the risks and vulnerabilities here include access to water, access to fuel for cooking fires, which, as you might imagine, then lead to knock-on effects in terms of deforestation. Another issue there we see with Cox's Bazar as well. Drought, sandstorms, a number of other ones as well. Let me just forward through here. And then the final one that I will mention is Zaatari in Jordan. And again, this idea of essentially a small city developing where there really was more of a rural area around. Now, Zaatari has grown and declined in size as a result of a number of the movements of Syrian migrants over this period, Syrian refugees over this period. But again, here we still see this a growing sense of permanence, at least in parts of this camp, which again have more the aspects of a small city than what we tend to think of as a refugee camp. But again, very different in different areas of the camp, and this also leads to significant vulnerability in terms of the solidity of the structures that different families have access to. Okay, so again, in terms of modeling the risk factors, we've been focusing on three particular ones that we were able to develop clearer and more consistent data for. One was looking at desertification in a longer term using satellite imagery and rainfall data. We were also looking at flooding, storm systems, surges, and this also includes hurricane and cyclone threats. To a lesser degree, we also were looking at some of the available data on seismic activity and vulnerabilities. And finally, we also looked at drought as one of the, so this is one of the first things that we're kind of going into this, developing this, this dashboard with. As I mentioned before, of the different camps that we have looked at and done work with, Cox's Bazar has the most developed system for even considering environmental risk at this point. They have a monthly meeting and in fact publish a monthly newsletter on cyclone and monsoon risks. They have a meeting of camp staff to talk through some of these different things, and they are the group that we've talked to the most about developing something that is specific to that camp. We also have looked at some other places that have not focused specifically on refugees and refugee camps, but have been evaluating environmental risk, usually on a countrywide basis. So New Zealand has been a particularly interesting model to look at in that regard. So some of the things that we're looking to add to our dashboard. So again, because we started with coronavirus, we wanted to start with looking at coronavirus statistics. This is still kind of pie in the sky to me, the environmental risk modeling, the weather modeling, and then the public health immunization rates, some of those other kinds of things. Creating site maps of individual refugee camps, again, working with UNHCR on that. And we've kind of talked through a it's not like a PowerPoint slide, but it's a multi-deck of kind of dashboards that you would be able to click through in order to get to these different metrics. So the next steps, this is very much work in progress. The next steps include creating the dashboard to make it both accessible and usable. One of the things, again, in thinking about the Hopkins or many of these other dashboards, you saw them changed over time, trying to use more accurate data, more understandable data, and then also refining that data. But it also has to be sustainable. I mean, this is not our full-time job, and it can clearly be a full-time job simply to update this. But these are the components that we're really focusing on. So the weather and environmental risk factors, the public health and COVID-19, at least in the immediate, and then looking at infrastructure and site maps for refugee camps using this kind of data. So I will stop talking at this point and open it up for questions. So that's kind of what we're working on right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo, for this fascinating introduction. I want to thank again my Borders and Migrations Initiative committee members, the Office of Campus Ministry, the Office of Mission and Identity, both at Canisius College, as well as the Departments of Modern Languages, Literatures and Cultures, Sociology, Anthrozoology, and ABEC, and the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs. And as part of our panel, in addition to Pablo, I have two colleagues here with me from Canisius College, Joshua Russell, who's the director of the graduate program in anthrozoology and an associate professor in the Animal Behavior, Ecology, and Conservation Department at Canisius College, whose research connects environmental education with animal studies, children's moral development, and queer theory. And my other colleague is Dr. Secil Ertorer, an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, Criminal Justice, and Environmental Studies at Canisius College, whose research focuses on experiences of refugee and immigrant populations. For our audience who would like to submit questions, they can do so through the YouTube channel that they are watching, or by texting their question to the number 716-249-6816. And while we are awaiting on audience response questions, Secil and Josh, I'll turn it over to you to ask some follow-up questions.
All right. Okay. Hi, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation. It's a very amazing and huge, big project. And, when I was listening, I couldn't stop thinking about the push factors that end with these refugee populations. People are fleeing from violence, as well as some people are fleeing from environmental disasters at home, and as a result, they become refugees. And from your research, we see that it doesn't end there. When they are settled, even for temporarily, when they are settled in a refugee camp, they still have to face environmental risks and issues. It's very horrifying in that sense. I cannot imagine life like this, keep trying to find security and safety, but it's not there. It's really saddening. But thank you so much. It gave me a different perspective, because I have never thought about, I have been working on with refugee populations, but I have never thought about that aspect of about living life in a refugee camp. Okay. Thank you so much for that. And my question will be about these refugee camps, because in your presentation, you talked about how these temporary refugee camps have become protracted, and they are like more permanent than temporary, right? So these are very interesting establishments, because when refugees are trying to find safety, they go, and most of the times they go to the closest safe neighboring countries, and but the countries to find a temporary solution, as settling them in refugee camps with the help of international organizations such as UNHCR. So, but like you said, it's like a temporary, it has been seen as a temporary solution. When it gets protracted, and if these are becoming more and more permanent, I can see so many problems there. So you have showed us pictures, it's huge land, right? So usually this is land occupied on the neighborhood country. So on one hand, the host countries are like, yes, far from sight, far from mind. At least they are not coming into the cities. I don't see and deal with them, and UNHCR is dealing with them. But on the other hand, if they become permanent, it's a land taken away from them. Do you know how they respond to this? As long as they don't have to deal with integrating these people, are they okay with that? And as long as the financial aspect of this financial burden is faced by the international organizations more than them, how do they react to this? And if they are more likely to become permanent, how are they going to deal with it? Do you know any?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, when you think about just two of the examples that I presented there, in the case of Zatari, you could make the argument that it is really kind of out of sight, out of mind. It wasn't near a land that was, it wasn't near a large city. I mean, you could certainly look at the case of Palestinian refugees, where it's a protracted situation in which you see some of the restrictions on Palestinians in different sort of host countries, what those restrictions have been over time. So that's an open question about what's going to happen. I mean, there's a lot of open questions about what's going to happen in terms of the Syrians in Zatari. Is Zatari going to remain essentially a small town in a place that had villages that had maybe 5,000-10,000 people, and now you have a town of 100,000 people? What does that look like? I don't think the land pressures are as significant there as they in that particular case as they are in Cox's Bazar. I mean, that there in Cox's Bazar, you're quite right that Bangladesh is an incredibly densely populated country, that was already dealing with what I would consider to be a real backlash against the ultra poor, who were seen in lots of ways as being in the way of Bangladesh's ascent to becoming a middle income country. Well, the Rohingya refugees there are seen as an even greater hindrance to that ascent. Right? Having 900,000 people there, and again, if we're thinking, you're already having this conversation about what happens in a low-lying deltaic country if the sea level rises by a meter, right? And so the scrabble for land that is already existing between the ultra poor in Bangladesh, the Rohingya become, seen as outsiders in multiple ways, even though there's this tendency to call anyone in South Asia who is Muslim and speaks Bengali as illegal and from Bangladesh, right? And so Rohingya have been constructed in that same sort of fashion. And if you see some of the ways in which they have been, there's a lot of like human trafficking of Rohingya by, Bengali fishermen who, there's a case right now of a boat full of Rohingya refugees who are drifting in the ocean because no one will allow them to come to shore. And so this sort of like this continued demonization of them, I think you're quite right that if this becomes a more permanent settlement, I mean, they came in 2017. And by 2019, before this latest coup, the Bangladesh government and the Myanmar government had said it's safe for them to go back. The Rohingya obviously didn't go back, but they were saying that it was safe for them to go back. Now, obviously, they're not going to go back. But what happens in the long run? I think you're absolutely right that it is the specific narrative that it's not even that they are taking money from us or resources, but specifically land. I didn't discuss one other dynamic in there, which is where they are located is close to an elephant reserve. Oh. And you've already started to hear a little bit of this discourse, not huge, but a little bit of this discourse of like, well, are they doing something they're setting back this, the conservation efforts, right? So it hasn't been huge, but you're starting to hear rumblings of that.
Yeah, because xenophobia is a very, common feeling. The fear of the other is already there, and then you bring these protracted situation, and then on the top of the pandemic, and more and more reasons to otherize and blame and scapegoat.
Right. I did want to say to your other question about these camps, I did want to make the clarification that these are not the only kinds of places that refugees are, right? These are quite frankly the better camps, right? They're run by the UNHCR, they're recognized as but there are lots of other much more informal or nationally run camps, right? You have nationally run camps in Jordan and Turkey and in a number of other countries that are not necessarily under the UNHCR mandate. So there are other places that people are living.
Just to give a little perspective to our Buffalo-based audience, the size of that camp you said was, I think, 900,000?
Yes.
That is almost the size of Greater Metro Buffalo, which is 1,130,000.
It's a lot bigger than Burlington.
So just to have, because sometimes big numbers don't mean anything, but if we think about it in terms of the larger population of Greater Metro Buffalo, that's the size of that camp. Other questions from our panel, Josh or Secil?
Yeah, thanks Pablo for coming. This was, obviously troubling. It's hard to say that somebody's research on this kind of topic is interesting. It feels kind of wrong to say that, but one of the things that I was thinking about that I hadn't really considered before was, you mentioned that even within the camps, you have microclimates, microgeographical features that make even within a camp some people more at risk of things like flooding or monsoons than others. And one of the questions that I really wanted to know was how are people actually distributing themselves within the camps? Is it a matter of like first people in get the high ground, or is there, because I think in the public narratives about refugees, we tend to homogenize them. And so I wonder what sort of dynamics are playing out in terms of where people are settling within the camps themselves.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that is a long-standing practice. I mean, when camps are originally started, they're laid out there's sort of handbooks. Actually, Jennifer Heinemann wrote sort of a classic book called Managing. I can't remember. It's about the politics of camps and humanitarian action, but it's kind of talks about the technologies that go into like creating the camps. And in fact, there was a person in our PhD program, Suzanne Hurley, I think was her name, who had actually, during the Rwandan genocide, had been in charge of like setting up some of these camps. And so I talked to her a little bit about the campification of these spaces. The first sort of camps are laid out with attention to services, with attention to some of these vulnerabilities. Okay, we're not going to situate them down here. We're not going to put them in. We know that this is more of an issue. How are we going to attend to sewage and drainage? You know, that's obviously a big kind of issue. But as the camps begin to grow in size, as more people come and more people come, two things happen. One is there's just like the triage effect of like, okay, we're just going to put some people here, we're going to put some people there. But then other things do come into play, which is that, you know, class and gender and connection and all those things do play a role in where you have access to what. You know, there are neighborhoods in Zatari. There are neighborhoods in a number of these different camps in which your access to those are based on all sorts of the other kinds of factors that people kind of come in with. And can make, you know, when you think about like, you know, what are some of the ongoing, you know, other kinds of vulnerabilities, the vulnerability of women to sexual violence in a number of these kinds of camps also actually has to do with their siting within, like some people have to go farther to go get wood. Some people have to, you know, so those kinds of things. So a lot of it does play out in an informal fashion as well. But you're right that like being able to access, and as they build out some of the newer and newer camps, they are on more and more marginal land.
Yeah. Yeah, because even the pictures that you showed us, I mean, like Zatari looked like it was pretty flat, but the Cox's Bazar one, I was like, okay, so it would be beneficial to be somebody who lived at the top of a hill versus somebody who lived at the bottom of a hill.
In some of those cases, but in some of those cases, in the monsoon seasons, the people who are higher up are in, and people who are lower down, but if you're built higher up, there is a serious risk of landslides and mudslides. So that does come in.
We have several questions from our listeners. One of them is related to this discussion. As the number of refugees is increasing, how is the geographic space and spaces they inhabit changing? Is the risk of climate change impact increasing both with size and with geography? And if so, how?
Yes, it definitely is something that we have been talking about for a while. My colleague Elizabeth Lundstrom at Boise State and I have been doing a lot of work on environmental displacement. There was a lot of talk about this in the late 90s, and there were some attempts to estimate. So if the climate changes, how many people will be forced to move? And the way in which it was done was somewhat crude. People would take sea level rise. They would map how many people live within certain zones. And then, you know, I mean, I'm sure we've all seen those pictures of this is what Manhattan would look like if it was, you know, if the sea level rose this much, et cetera. But of course, that's, I mean, what that doesn't take into account is that people move, right? It's not, they move beforehand, et cetera. But I think what we have seen right now is this ongoing conversation about, you know, wildfires, the disappearance of islands in the South Pacific. I saw in the Times this morning a story about barrier islands off the Carolinas and saying, is it worth going back? I think it was the Florida Keys that got hit last year or 2 years ago, completely cut off. And so there was this question of like, well, is it worth building back? You're seeing this in the communities out west or in Australia where people are saying, is it worth building back? Now, a lot of times the way in which we talk about whether or not people will live somewhere, it also presumes, one, that we all have the option to move, that we all have the option to go somewhere else. You know, speaking of Bangladesh, and, you know, I grew up when I was young in Bengal, and there was always this kind of like, oh, well, you know those monsoons are going to come, the flooding is going to come, why do those peasants keep going back there? And I'm like, well, A, what land do people have access to? But also, this also tends to be productive land, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really difficult question. And to look at some of the ways that national governments have responded to this is sometimes really problematic. There's some very interesting literature in geography around the concept of green grabbing, which has been used to kind of dispossess people from land. In Bangladesh, when I was looking at this, what I was seeing was that certain populations were being displaced on the basis of not their current, you know, not because they were currently displaced by climate change, but they were being proactively displaced because at some point they may be displaced by climate change. They lived in these marginal places, so therefore, let's move them out of the way so we don't have to move them later on. It was completely nuts, but unfortunately not uncommon.
Wow. Another question from our audience, speaking of national governments. Can Pablo talk about his work resurrecting the US resettlement program and some of the challenges involved? And is there a rough timeline of how long this will take?
I'll just speak briefly to this, but when the Biden administration, before they came into office, they had a platform of bringing the resettlement program to 125,000 people approved for settlement. Just to put that into context, the last two Obama administrations, it had been about 75,000 and then 85,000 people admitted into the US. In 2016, it was supposed to be 110,000 people. Trump came in, cut that, ended up being about 55,000. Each year he was in office, less and less refugees were admitted. This past year, it was supposed to be 15,000 people. Because of the pandemic, it ended up being 11,000 people, 11,000. So the Biden administration came into office and looked at the absolute mess that was left for them. So the resettlement system has been atrophied in all sorts of ways. Overseas, it's been atrophied in terms of vetting people to come here and all of that stuff. And here in the US, it's their funding has been cut so much that many of the programs offices have closed. So the hope is that we can rebuild it, but that it will take, so the new plan is to resettle 62,500 people this year. I would be amazed if we could resettle 20,000 people this year. I'd be happy to see that. But the last thing I'll say about that is that while I think we should rebuild it, I think we should rebuild it much better. I think there were all sorts of problems with it before Trump came in. And so I think this is an opportunity to rebuild not the same.
Thank you, Pablo. Maybe to follow up on that with another question. Well, and also to put that in context for Buffalo. I mean, Buffalo's got a very large resettled population and has depended on our renaissance in large part due to that. So there's been some impact from that. You talked about your data science and the dashboards and stuff, and it made me think of the Florida woman who kept getting arrested and her data confiscated for providing data that the government of Florida did not like. But the question that was sent to us is about the role of data scientists and how data scientists can be used to prevent, help, or model in better ways.
I mean, it's interesting that you give the example from Florida. Again, to draw not on this particular data, which will be, I mean, some of it, we've mostly been working with publicly available data, which has holes in it in different ways, and that's been part of the challenge. But the politics of getting access to data, the politics of what is done with that data were really driven home to me. I'm not going to draw from this project, but my US-based work to make 2 points. One was right after the Trump administration came into power, I was part of a large scale study that was asked when they were trying to come up with the new numbers. And in that study, we were trying to find out what was the cost of the refugee program versus the benefits. And so we did a pretty narrow, cost benefit, like how much, tax receipts were generated, economic activity, blah, 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 how much the program cost. It was a 90-page report, and it showed about, 87 billion surplus as a result of the refugee program. And that was replaced by a 3-page document by Stephen Miller that simply compared usage of public benefits by refugees to the general population. If my students handed in a cost benefit analysis like that, you can imagine that would not be satisfying. And then to add to that, I published a bunch of this work on refugee resettlement in the US, and I started to have researchers write to me and say, oh, this is really interesting. Where did you get your city level data? Because where did you get the city level data? How do you know this on the cities? And I said, what do you mean? I got it off the publicly available RAPS database that's published by the State Department. They're like, no, it's not. I said, what do you mean it's not? So I go and I look, and it's all gone. So right now, all of that data, and so I had downloaded each year dutifully. I had, so I had 230 cities across the US, and how many refugees were approved to go to each of those. All gone. And I'm like, why did they remove this? And, I had other colleagues who'd contacted the State Department and said, what happened to the city data? And they got the answer, the data that's available is the data that's available. And so now people are using this database that I have, and, I don't know if there's other records of it somewhere else. So sometimes, yeah, our access to data, I know I'm not really answering the question that was asked, but yeah, it's been an eye opener.
That's incredible to me. I want to remind our listeners that they can text message questions to 716-249-6816. Meanwhile, Secil and Josh, if you'd like to ask Pablo some more questions.
Sure. I have many actually, but okay. First is a quick one. In my research with refugee populations, I have seen lots of stateless children because, they were born in refugee camps, or they were born in the host countries that do not give citizenship. Lots of children with no records, nothing. And, it's the world is avoiding that. This is a serious problem because we are talking about future of lots of people. They have no record of existence, and no citizenship, stateless populations. And in your data during this research, have you come across that kind of data? Did you recognize such a problem in the camps you realized?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a huge ongoing issue. And also because there's a lot of inconsistency across countries and across even camps themselves. So in an earlier example of a protracted conflict or a protracted situation is, again, the Bhutanese Lhotshampas in Nepal. And one of the things I found was that depending on which camp you were in, so there were 7 main camps that people were in, there were some of the camps where people were able to essentially commute from the camps for work and for education. They could basically go and work in Kathmandu. And there were a number of other camps where people simply could not at all. And so you can imagine that your outcomes as a result of that are really quite different. The Borderless Higher Education for Refugees program that's at York University that works with a number of these camps, I think has recognized some of the aspects of this, especially in terms of a lack of access to education and healthcare and these other kinds of things. But what you raise is such a central issue around citizenship. If someone does not have access to citizenship at all, and to be quite frank, there is not the same kind of reckoning, especially of children born in refugee camps, as there are of other stateless populations, at least by the UNHCR. I mean, it's almost a different kind of category in which right? Because like other sorts of stateless situations, the Soviet Union goes away and all of a sudden you have, you know, Azeris who are now displaced in a different kind of way. That is a different way of imagining what the stateless person is, rather than a person who carries this ethnicity and identity, which is dangerous in certain circumstances, and in other cases simply unprovable. Like, how do you go about proving what your kind of background is? And one last sort of consequence of this is, as we move to more biometric screenings of refugees, and we keep more and more of this data that says stuff like, prove who you are. You know, there was this discourse at one point that African refugees in the US were gaming the system. And the reason they were accused of this was that you would have people being listed as parts of families because, you know, you had larger extended families, but people would all have the same birth date. But they were not using the same birth date because they were trying to commit fraud. It was because there was no paperwork in so many cases. There was no documentation to support what they were doing. And yet, in any kind of resettlement, we increasingly, you know, securitize that and say like, well, if you can't prove that, then you are. So, I mean, the consequences are so dire. So yeah, it's a huge issue.
Can I ask a quick question just about, I mean, because this is in my area of research, and I've talked to some students in my classes about conservation organizations working with governments and displacing people, displacing the poor, displacing indigenous populations through conservation efforts that, you know, between the 80s, 90s, the noughties, people began to recognize the human impacts of conservation and talk about it at least more. And I wonder now what the role is of major environmental NGOs in some of these discussions, because I mean, they can talk about how the human impact of conservation, those things are connected, but I don't know if, I mean, do you know if any organizations like WCS or, you know, World Wildlife Fund or Conservation International are involved at all with refugee issues?
There are some. World Wildlife Fund. I had a friend who actually worked for World Wildlife Fund. He got his degree in social work, a master's in social work, and then got a job with the World Wildlife Fund, basically going and convincing these villagers in Vietnam to move because they were, and then he went and did his PhD at Berkeley and has a very different career now. But anyway, but you know, it really, there was some recognition of this, in part because there had been, you know, the famous book, Mark Dowie's Conservation Refugees. There's a few things that kind of took up this question, Parks Without People, this sort of notion. There are some organizations that definitely look at that aspect. In some cases, the bigger challenge is people who are not physically displaced, but they're displaced from practices. So they'll find that their village is all of a sudden within the boundaries of a tiger reserve.
Right.
I'm not sure I'd want to live in the midst of a tiger reserve, but you know, but anyway, so they're finding that they cannot use the woods. They cannot, you know, there are different kinds of conflicts that come up. And the default in many of those cases, I'm thinking about a lot of this in India, is to simply move the village. The onus isn't necessarily on the conservation organization. Again, Libby, Elizabeth Lundstrom does a lot of this work in Limpopo, in the park in Southern Africa. And the discourses about poaching and, you know, sort of indigenous practices are often really blurred and quite problematic in different ways. There is more attention paid to this, but it's still a serious concern, yeah.
Actually, Pablo, I wonder if you could follow up a little bit on what Josh asked you and something you had mentioned earlier in your presentation. I think it was the camp in Bangladesh, but I don't recall. That's next to an elephant reserve.
Yeah, it's not right next to it, but it's somewhat close by. There's actually 3 different, as part of this work, I had been looking to see if there were any conservation projects nearby. And, that whole area used to be a vast wetlands. And, part of the risks for Bangladesh and West Bengal are really the destruction of the mangroves. Like that's a whole other sort of issue that's removed natural barriers. But hand in hand with that, there are a number of these different kinds of conservation projects. They are, for the most part, smaller in scale. So there are a number of other kind of keystone species that they are focused around. Because elephants are charismatic megafauna, so there's a clear focus on that. I have not seen as yet that there is a direct conflict, but I have seen the question raised in multiple local newspapers in Dhaka saying, well, what's going to happen? I mean, coming back to the earlier question about the long-term stay, what's going to happen to the elephants? How do we maintain that? Not really raising the other issues, which have much more to do with urbanization, and like there are other issues that are more top of mind.
But then, so is the concern over the elephants or other fauna, is that related to? I mean, is that related to the refugees really, or is this related to future income from tourism, or like what's the concern?
No, it's conflict over land. So if the refugees are, here and they're already on somewhat marginal land, they're then going to need to move further and further afield to get wood for cooking fuel. They're going to need other kinds of resources. This is already, and if circumstances change and they're like, I knew of Cox's Bazar. Cox's Bazar is called Cox's Bazar because under British colonialism, it was like a seaside resort kind of area, right? It was like beachy, a very beachy sort of area. It's not where there's a reason that in a country where there is a dearth of land, that this was not already developed. It is not really a place that you would put a permanent large-scale urban development. So the future of that as a place for a large-scale urban setting is questionable at best.
Right. I guess what I'm trying to understand is there concern actually environmental and for the animals, or is that masking a racial or class concern?
It's an interesting concern because I do think there is. So this is getting to Josh's earlier point as well, is that one of the things that I have seen in some of the work I've done in South Asia is a rising middle class environmentalism. And that rising middle class environmentalism often sees the poor. And so in the case of the Rohingya refugees, they speak the same language and they're also Muslim. So really the distinction is one of national origin. But it's really much more poverty because in Rakhine State, there are a rural, relatively impoverished group. And so in the same way that when I was working in Calcutta, one of the middle-class neighborhoods I was working in, the neighborhood association had done all this work to clean up a local pond and make it, beautify it and this and that for their children, environmental education, all this kind of stuff. But one of the things they did was they went to the local police and wanted them to demolish a slum that was about a mile away. Because their complaint was that, well, we've now made this better and people understand the value of the environment, but these poor people who don't know any better are coming and messing it up. And so that sort of politics, I think, is more what's at play. The idea that like we have invested in protecting the elephants, but these people who we feel bad for them, they're poor, et cetera, but they're going to start using those, they're going to denature that kind of place as a result.
Thank you for that clarification, Pablo. We have another question from our listeners. The increase in refugee numbers over the last 10 years is staggering. Is that rate likely to increase? Are there projections for numbers of refugees over the next 10 years?
Oh, I mean, that's hard to predict. It's not as though there were no conflicts between, 2000 and 2010, right? There were lots of conflicts. At the time, however, a result of sort of post 9/11 securitization was a drastic decrease in refugee acceptance in different kinds of places. But you then did see after 2010 a number of these different conflicts grow. Right now, Syria obviously is a producer of one of the largest flows, but you have other ones. I mean, in the Western Hemisphere, it's Venezuela, right? It's not a violent conflict, but it is a primarily economic issue. Colombia still has one of the largest internally displaced populations in the world. So you do have these other kind of ongoing things. I don't know what the future holds in terms of political conflicts and displacement. I don't know if the numbers will rise more. Ukraine is another one. There are other ones that are ongoing. I think the big question people have are really about environmental ones. But again, coming back to something you said at the outset, which is that these are also inextricably linked in their, I don't want to sound like an environmental determinist, that's not my intent, but there are overlapping factors. If you look at Syria, the Syrian conflict is certainly not caused by drought, but you did have a significant drought that drove people more to cities. You had an underinvestment in the water system. You had the removal of agricultural subsidies. In the Rohingya case, it is absolutely entrenched ethnic conflict, but Rakhine State was hit by a huge cyclone in 2010, catastrophic flooding in 2015. The state was opened up to export-oriented agriculture by the junta. They signed an agreement to build a oil shipment port. Like, there are all these kinds of interlocking things that I think drive displacement, environmental as well as political.
Secil or Josh, if you have more questions.
Just to, go with, what Pablo said as an answer to the last question. Also, I know in many fields in demography, we do make some future projections, but we do not make these kind of projections for refugee populations. Also, UNHCR doesn't make that. It's just, but the statistics show that they are in increase. And also, there are also other issues about how you define refugees, because, the UNHCR definition, there's a convention definition, but all the states do not agree. And also that definition, for instance, does not include environmental refugees. Then there's another category for environmental refugees. So it's a complicated area, and the numbers also depend on how you define refugee. But again, there are no projections, but the numbers are rising and the future doesn't look so optimistic in that sense. But like I said, we don't make the projections like we do for different populations, like for, projections for aging populations, working group. But for refugee cases, it's so hard to know, because how do you project the social conflict happening within a country, a civil war happening, or an environmental issue happening, right? These are the things one cannot really project.
And you're quite right that, so much of this depends on the definition of categories, right? Who is able to define who is a legitimate refugee, asylum seeker, et cetera? I mean, one of the other things that happened under the US administration, the last administration, was narrowing those definitions, saying that domestic violence was no longer an acceptable category for an asylum seeker, saying that, whether Trump's Muslim ban was successful or not, the fact remains that we moved from 2015, 75% of refugees in the US accepted that year were Muslim, to by 2019, 0% of refugees accepted into the US were Muslim. And so there's so much power in that ability to name, to define. I often say to my students, what's the difference between a migrant and a refugee? It's really the geographical point of arrival. It's who the UNHCR says is a refugee and who is an asylum seeker. In Europe, they don't tend to make that distinction between refugee and asylum seeker. It's just kind of the same, in many ways. But here we use those categories to distinguish. And I've always thought this, that, my family, not my parents, but my family fled across the border in what was then to become India and Bangladesh in 1946, fleeing terrible violence. Anybody who fled between 1946 and 1948 was granted refugee status by India. Anybody who came after 1948 was an economic migrant. Now, anybody who came after 1948 overwhelmingly did not have the resources to come before, right? It was much more that it was poorer people, peasants, et cetera, who came later on. And so again, it's a quirk of sometimes timing, but usually it's who is able to define who is a refugee and who is not.
I just have one more quick question. I mean, your comment about the monkeys raiding the supplies also made me think of, pushes to recognize One Health, like connections between human health, animal, wildlife health, and environmental health. And, we can imagine COVID being the first, well, not the first, but the latest in a string of increasing numbers of diseases that will come because of environmental degradation and may come through and be transported by refugee populations, sometimes migrants. What do you see as being done to address that, or I mean, I don't know what the question is, but I mean, that's a concern that I have.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think it's a broader challenge of the way in which indigenous, tribal, more rural communities in some places are sort of viewed, rather than looking just at the broader problem of human encroachment into animal habitat, right? Like the fact that we are more exposed to zoonotic disease because of where we are going, and because of all sorts of our food system and what we actually harvest from the animal world. But all too often, I mean, when we started this project, it was very clear that that part of the lack of spread of COVID-19 in these camps was their very literal lockdown, right? Because they were seen as a place of potential disease, right? And a place that was less worthwhile, in the same way that prisons are, but at least in this case, the entire infrastructure of the camp was locked off in a way that I don't think prisons were, certainly not in the US. But I do think that sort of interrelationship is much less understood. The concern about, so I'm actually writing this piece in a book that's on white supremacy and US media cultures. And I'm actually writing this chapter called The Specter of the Refugee. And it's really about this idea that, because if some of these white supremacists like Steve Bannon and Marine Le Pen and some of these people, one of their foundational books that they talk about all the time, in the same way that other white supremacists talk about that Turner Diaries, is this book called The Camp of the Saints. And The Camp of the Saints is this book written in, I think, the 70s, and it's all about, imagines this dystopian future in which refugees fleeing environmental degradation from South Asia overwhelm Europe and America, and they carry with them disease. And so this idea of the fear of the brown planet, the fear of the black planet, is very much and you saw it expressed in this kind of, it's both the supposed like, the terrorism of Muslim refugees, but also these other dangers that are supposedly kind of wrapped up in the refugee, in the figure of the refugee. So, yeah, but I don't want to end on that note because I did want to say, I do worry sometimes, and I feel, I really shouldn't be saying this right at the end, that like I paint such a damningly disenfranchised image of these camps themselves. I have to say, like, one of the things when I was saying, like, I really want to go to the camps to do some of this work is because it is pretty remarkable to me. It's not like people are just sitting around being passive recipients of all of this that is happening to them. There is a great deal of organization and advocacy and creation of resources and services. In some of those maps that I was showing you of the services that we were looking at, a lot of those some are provided by humanitarian organizations, but a lot of it is organized from within. And some of the kind of advocacy, there was some really interesting things there in the Cox's Bazaar. There are a bunch of these micro enterprises that turned really early on to producing personal protective gear and equipment. There are these really interesting in Zatari, in Cox's Bazaar, in Kikuma and Dadaab. We saw some really interesting efforts to train local people within the camps on emergency response, on first aid, but also on there's a fascinating network of spotters in Cox's Bazaar for landslide risk. There's a whole system of, I know I really should have said this before. Why am I saying this right at the end? But there's this whole system of citizen science. Essentially, that's what it is citizen science used to kind of spot a lot of these kinds of things. And that's something that I really want to learn more about and support. So I didn't want it just to come off as being so disempowering, which I'm realizing it feels like.
Oh, thanks.
I'm really glad that you brought this up, because it was actually in one of the questions I initially prepared. Because, as someone doing research in this area, I have always seen this issue, and I have had to deal with this issue that the refugees being seen as, passive aid receivers, right? But they are not helpless passive aid receivers. There's a refugee agency. These are human beings, and they are actually, they are very strong. And in my research, I have seen them. I have done research with groups Karen and Karenni refugees in Thailand, and I have met people who were even born and spent all their lives in the camps. Like I'm talking about, being born in a refugee camp and spending your 20, 25 years in the same camps. But, these are not just people who rely on the donations, help by UNHCR or others. They are nurses, they are teachers, they do everything to get their education. They have set up their systems in the camp. So when you actually do your research, talk with them, speak with them, you see that they create their own cities, they create their own lives, their own micro spaces there. And, they are very active and they create their decision-making processes. It's so amazing to see how these processes just happen. And also in the case of this refugee camp, like, in this camp, there were so many people, I mainly did my research with Karen and Karenni, but they were living together with Burmese, and these were ethnic groups fighting each other, killing each other, and they end up in the same refugee camp. And then they create this great place with social solidarity and becoming just neighbors and citizens of the same place, right? So I think it's so amazing also to see in this aspect. Right.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. I completely agree. And in fact, I would say that one of the things that we unfortunately waste in the resettlement process all too often is not to build on those kinds of skills. That when we bring people even here, that we don't recognize education, we don't recognize experience, and we de-skill in the same way that many immigrants find themselves de-skilled through the process. I absolutely agree, yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for a turn to something slightly more positive. And, you know, I've hosted this now for, I don't know, 6 semesters or something like that. And it's always a challenge to find something hopeful or positive. Not to be Pollyanna about it, but to find inspiration. And so as we wind down, I'm wondering if I can turn it over to my panel to either ask or opine if there's any other things you want to say regarding positive approaches, positive ways of doing things, ways that other people can get involved and to impact change. Because I think it's one thing to learn about these things. The next step is to do something. And so as we wind down, if there's any thoughts on action that can be taken or ways to ameliorate these situations through education or activism that can help us take positive response to this.
I mean, I would just say that certainly advocating for rebuilding the refugee programs here, I think is a really good step that we can take, which quite frankly really benefit, you know, cities like Burlington or Buffalo or Utica or Lincoln, Nebraska, many places across the US, Canada, Europe. There are small towns in Germany and France that would be completely falling apart if it wasn't for Syrian refugees going to them. So I think that it's in our best interests, not just as a humanitarian impulse, to support that. And I've seen lots of students get involved in that kind of work locally and abroad. But I also did love your comment about like the agency of refugees. I think that that is something to really keep in mind, because again, not to you know, pretend that the suffering isn't there, but to also recognize the amazing strength. Like, yeah, it really blows you away when you see what people have lived through and what they do.
Well, Pablo, it's been an honor to have you and learn from you, and I look forward to reading more and learning more from you. And I really want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Russell and Dr. Ertorer, for co-hosting this with me and for introducing me to Pablo, whose work I did not know. And so I thank all of you, and I thank our audience for these wonderful questions. And I'm sorry we didn't get to quite all of them, but I appreciate the audience participation as well. And for those of you still listening, we will have this recorded. It will be available by tomorrow morning on the Canisius Borders and Migrations page, and Pablo will send you a link too, so that you can share it as you see fit.
Awesome.
And so that will be available for people to watch and or share. And also our final session for this semester's Borders and Migrations series is on April 20th at 6 p.m. on immigration and populism, comparing Poland, Hungary, and the United States. And I hope you will be able to join us for that event. Look for it on social media. And again, Pablo, Josh, and Secil, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It was really a wonderful conversation. I really appreciated it.
Thanks, Pablo.
All right, thank you guys.